So I'm going to go back to my Kotlin editor, and we want to try a few other things. We'll create one more class. Yes, should be a good weekend to relax at Delano. I think it's going to rain. Kenneth, you shouldn't actually have to do anything to run the tests. So long as you create the Kotlin file under the test project here, where I have mine created. And once you create a class, we just need to import the JUnit testing class. And once we do that, anytime we declare a function with the @test decorator, Android Studio should give us this little run button here. So you shouldn't have to set anything up in order to run these. Yeah, that sounds pretty busy, Delano. So hopefully you have a couple days off. So yeah, Kenneth, try that and let me know if you're still having an issue. Okay. All right, so we'll create. Okay, excellent, great. So let's play around with a bit more of the some of the null checking. Okay. So let's create a new test here. I'll create a new function called cannot be null. I think I did, Hayden, but thank you for reminding me. Yes, I did. I appreciate people reminding me. I did forget on Monday and the last part of my class. Then when class was done, I had to record the last 20 minutes of class, which I prefer not to do. So I would rather be reminded, and I've started it. Thank you. Okay, so let's use a var. Yeah, it's true. So let's make a var flavor. And because Kotlin is strongly typed, we can declare so I'll add some other flavor here. Let's see, somebody had suggested death by chocolate. So we still use var, and then after the variable, we declare the type. So unlike in Java, where we would just declare string flavor equals. The Kotlin syntax is we use val or var, and then a colon, and then the data type. So now, and I guess I'll keep my spelling consistent. What happens if I try and then set my variable? Get to your question in just a second. So we can assign a string value, but I can't null it out. Okay, good question, Edwin. Yes, so Hayden, that's right. We can change the value, but we can't change the type. So Edwin, if we don't specify the data type, let's see. So in this case, the data type is assumed. Once we assign it a string value, even though we haven't specified that it's a string, Kotlin is going to interpret this to be of type string. So you can see the compiler says it's a string. So either way, whether we explicitly declare it as a string or not, Kotlin's going to treat that variable like a string as soon as it's assigned a value that's of type string. Yeah, so part of what this is doing is it's preventing these null pointer exception errors. It's trying to prevent these things. Let's add one more function out. Actually, I think we'll leave it there. Okay, so in order to get this to pass, I've got to comment that out. So even without string declaration, Kotlin assumes it's a string and won't allow null values. Okay. So my code is not, our code isn't going to compile. Code won't compile so long as we have this line of code. Once we declare it as a string, we can't then set it, wipe it out, set it to null. Okay. Let's try a different test. Let's modify this one a little bit. We'll call this one can be null. So we want to do a similar thing. We're going to declare it as a string. So I'm putting the code back to how I had it before. So right now this is going to give me an error. How could I change this to allow this assignment to null to work? So I want to leave line 54, but I want to make a, want to make a modification on line 53 that is going to permit the nulling out of this variable. Yep. Okay. That's a good suggestion. Yep. Thanks. So what would that question mark mean? That does fix our error. Yeah. Me, Sam, Hayden, you guys have got the right answer. Yeah. It's Michael. That's right. That it's nullable, or Tim, that it's optional. Right. So meaning, so the difference here between line 46 is once this variable is declared as a string, it can only hold a string value. Yeah, you're right, Nadia. But if we want to permit nulls, then we want to declare our variable this way. So this is something you have to keep in mind. Yes, Kartik, you can parse it. So for example, here on line 48, one of the suggestions we got for this error was add a toString to the call. So this makes it go away, makes the error go away, but now flavor is not really a null, it's an empty string, and that's not the same thing. Okay, so the value isn't null, it's an empty string. So if we want it to allow nulls, then we want to use this method instead of declaring the variable. We should indicate that it's optional and that a null value is allowed. If we declare it this way as a string on line 46, then this isn't really setting it to null. Okay. But that's a good question, Kartik. Thanks. I'm glad that you raised that question. Generally, yes. It's not recommended that we use any in Kotlin. We generally want to be explicit about the common practice is yeah, it's not that different from TypeScript. You're right, Kartik. That's a good point. So let's look at this just a little bit more. Let's see, what do we want to call this one? Let's make a new one. We'll call it check for null. So again, I'll declare it same way we did in our previous test, as a nullable string or an optional string. There you go. There's Danilo's favorite. So if it's not null, okay, so now we can run this one. So our test passes. So long as we've assigned a value, it's going to print the value. Otherwise, it'll print this message. Okay, let's try. We're going to try two more because there's two other constructs in our slide I wanted to go over. I wanted to look at let, and of course, we have to finish with the Elvis operator. So we'll create two more functions to try these out. Two more tests. Then we'll move on to the second part of our lesson. We'll call this one let check. Function names don't really matter. Again, we'll make it an optional string. Okay. Michael likes banana boat. I think that's about 6 kinds of wrong, but Michael, you win the day. Actually, let's do this. Let's set it to null first. Okay. So because our parameter is nullable, it's going to allow this. If I take the question mark out, my editor complains. So we can use the let keyword to check whoops, sorry, it's got to be curly brackets. Sorry about that. So in this case, if the flavor, sorry, it's this. I apologize. Let's see what happens when we run this. So if we run this test, so it doesn't print anything in this case because the value is null. If we assign a value, and our variable isn't null, so when our variable is not null, the let happens. The let allows this code to execute. When it is null, nothing happens. Yep, so Hayden, that's one way of doing it. We're actually going to look at using the Elvis operator. That's going to be the last thing. One other small note. This is more of a job interview kind of thing. You mentioned ternary. It's important if you ever get asked in a job or on something, a written job application, the spelling is this way, with an E. In fact, it may even be this way. I'll have to look that up, but it's not a U. I'll have to look at the proper way to spell that. Ternary. Thank you, Kenneth. Yes, it does, Hayden. So you can inject variables with the $ prefix like you could in JavaScript in a string. Yes. Okay, so let's try the Elvis operator. Here's our last one, our last test, and then we'll go back into playing around with layouts. So here's our last test. We'll call this the Elvis check. So again, we'll declare a nullable string and we'll assign it to null. So no initial value. Whoops. So now we're going to use Elvis. So the question mark, so if it's null, assign another value. So here we'll use our Elvis check. So if flavor is null, print something else. If flavor is not null, it will print flavor. So we'll try this and then we'll modify it. So when we run the test this way, it should print something else because flavor is null, which it does. Now we'll change null value to a string value. Somebody else said Oreo. So now we'll run our print statement again with the Elvis operator. So in the first case, flavor will be null. So our Elvis check should print something else. Once we assign a value to the variable, and we run this command again with the same Elvis operator, the second time it should print Oreo. So we'll just run that. So that's what we get. So Elvis allows us to check for a null and provide something else. If the value isn't null, then we're going to work with that value. So simple way, Elvis basically is a simple ternary operator, really short syntax. So Hayden, you kind of posted the ternary example in the chat of what it would look like. That would work, but using the Elvis operator is just a shorter way of doing it. You don't need the if, and you don't need to run to repeat the print line command. It is much shorter. So the Elvis operators, yes, it's checking for a null automatically. So again, it's designed to help prevent null pointer exceptions, which is by far the most common exception that we get when we're developing in Java. 3 years of working with Java, 2.5 years, you guys probably couldn't even count how many times you've encountered null pointer exceptions in your Java code. So using some of these constructs, using the Elvis operator, using let, and using the nullable or non-nullable parameters, yeah, all of this is designed to keep your code more accurate and reduce the number of null pointer exceptions that you're going to get. Yes, Michael, pretty much the same thing in C#. Correct. Good point. Yeah, it is. It's absolutely the worst. So this was a huge focus and a huge motivator for the creation of yeah, it does. So a huge motivator for the creation of Kotlin. Okay, so I wanted to show you those constructs, and I've put kind of this list here. So these slides are in the lesson 2 folder. I do want to play around a little bit. I want to build a new activity. Sorry, we can actually modify the existing main activity. I want to play it with the layouts a little more because there are a few other things with layouts I wanted to cover last week that we didn't do. I'm not going to keep you the full time, 3 hours today. We'll see if we can wrap this up by around 1 o'clock if we can. Okay. So a few things that I wanted to talk about. One thing we didn't look at last week was in my lesson notes, but never got there, was about how to size things in Android. So sizing things on a mobile app obviously is different than sizing things on desktop or web apps because we really are dealing with scaling at a whole other level. So Android we've got 3 different units available to size things. So if we put, for example, an image on or a button, we've got 3 units. The most common unit we're going to use is DP, which stands for density independent pixels. So density independent pixels, we use this for sizing most visual elements. So for example, the size of an image, the size of a button, margins, padding, all of these things are sized in DP. And basically it scales based on your device size. So the basic equivalent is 1 DP is 1 pixel on a 160 dpi screen. So 1.5 dp would be 1.5 pixels, would be 1 pixel on a 240 dpi screen. Okay, so things will obviously look bigger on different resolutions. So we use density independent pixels most of the time. We have the option to use standard pixels like we might use on the web with CSS. We generally don't use them though, because that means the size is fixed and it's not going to scale or change at all for different resolutions. So generally speaking, even though we have this option to size thing in pixels, we don't typically use it when we're working in Android. The other unit that we use are called SP, for scale independent pixels. So it's like density independent pixels, it's like DP, it scales for screen resolution, but it has to take another variable into account, and that is the user's font size preferences. So for example, Michael and I, we may have the exact same device, but maybe I've increased my default text size on my device. So that means when we're looking at, let's say, the font on a button, we don't want to write it in DP, in density independent pixels, because that means that both Michael and I are going to see the same text size on that button. If we use SP instead, even if we're using the same device at the same screen resolution, the font is going to appear bigger to me if I have a larger font size in my user preferences on the device. Yep, it is. Okay, so keep that in mind, that the scale independent pixels is for text elements only. We don't use it for anything else because it uses the user font size. DP we use for everything other than text. Okay, so we'll play around with this a little bit. The other thing to keep in mind, we talked last week, and I know some of you mentioned it in that little review spreadsheet. You talked about storing strings in a string resource file instead of hard coding it. We might also save sizing dimensions in a separate resource file. The strings.xml resource file, that exists in our project by default, but it's standard practice that we create a dimensions file called dimens. So we could set up standard dimensions. So things like the text sizes for buttons. If we have 20 buttons in the app, we don't want to define every button text as being 14 dp. Because if we want to change those button sizes, we then have to go into every activity and every button and change it. So kind of like a CSS file. We could use styles, but generally the Android practice is dimensions in DP and SP actually are stored in their own file. So maybe we want kind of standard padding or margins around elements. So our dimens file would look something like this. We declare a dimen node, we give it a name and a value. And then in the layout, rather than hard coding the margin as 10 dp, which we could do, we would just refer to this resource in the dimens file. The styles are generally used for colors and fonts, but the dimensions are typically stored separately from the styles. Could go in styles, but that's kind of standard practice, is a separate file. Okay, so let's build. We're going to build a simple login form. We can get a little more review, a little more work done with the constraints that we did last week, and then we can play around a little bit with the sizing and dimensions of things. So I'm just going to go open up my activity main.xml. Okay, over here. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this hello world text view that Android Studio puts here by default. Let's get rid of that. And we want to put on a couple of text views and a button. So we could use this plain text. That'll just be a regular text input. But instead, I want to use the email and password text inputs and then a button. So I'm going to first click on email. And I'll just drag it into my component tree. And it gets this default ID of edit text, text email address, which of course is a horrendous ID, way too long and complicated. So I'm going to just call this, change the ID up here. I'm just going to call it email edit text. So the usual naming convention in Android is in camel case. Usually we have a descriptive name of the view, and then we have the type of object that it is. So it's an edit text. And I want to center this horizontally in the middle of the screen. I could do this in my code view, but the easy way, if I just click on the right side and drag, it'll anchor it to the right. And then if I click on the left and drag to the left, this will set up two constraints. So you can see over here in the constraints, it says that start is to the start of the parent window, end is to the end of the parent window. So that'll center it horizontally in my screen. I'm not going to worry about the top and the bottom yet. Then I want a password. So up here in my palette under text, 2 items above the email is the password view. I'm going to drag one of those. I'm going to change the ID of this to password edit text. Again, I'll use camel case. And again, I'll just drag. Well, it's a little hard to do because they're overlapping. So maybe what I'll do is go into my code view and I'll set up some constraints. So again, we've got an email edit text and a password edit text. So go into the code. Android complains because we haven't put any vertical constraints on. That's okay. So in my password, if I just type the word end, it'll then bring up this layout constraint, end to end of, and I'm going to choose parent. I'm then going to type the word start and set the start to start of, which is the parent. These are the exact same attributes I have here on lines 15 and 16. So you could also just copy them if you want. Okay. So each of these edit text is now centered horizontally on the screen. If I go back to design view, they appear one on top of each other. I then want to anchor my password underneath our email. So if I start typing top, I want the layout constraint, the top is to the bottom of, and then I can just pick our email edit text. So this is going to move Left and right to zero that. Yep, you can do that as well. But typically we want to anchor them to the parent window, and we'll see why in a bit. So now if I go back, now my password is underneath. Okay, thanks, Hayden. So that's now that I have a vertical constraint, I have one vertical constraint on the password. Notice this isn't underlined in red anymore. But my email, there's no vertical constraint, so it's still underlined. We're going to anchor the email to the top. So I'm going to constrain the top to the top of the parent. So my email, the end is to the end of parent, the start is to the start of parent, the top is to the top of parent. My edit text, the start and end are to the parent, but the top is to the bottom of my email. So I'm going to run the app right now and we can have a look at it. So I'll just click first I've got to, in this little drop down, when I click run, it wants to run my unit test. So I'm going to choose the app. I want to run my app in the device. I don't want to run the unit tests. So this little drop down here, pick my little green Android icon with app. I want to run my app. So Gradle's going to build the app. It's going to launch my virtual device. Okay. Tells me to upgrade my ADB binary. I won't worry about that for now. So here's what I get. I have two text inputs. An email, and a password. Now you'll notice also our width, it's set to wrap the content. So if we have default content, these items, the width and height will automatically size. You'll notice my email address here is actually getting cut off. So I may want to size this and make them bigger. So we can either use a dimension, we can set a dimension in pixels. We could also make those boxes fill the entire width of the screen. So that's an option. We'll have to play around with both. It probably wouldn't be bad in portrait view to make the email the full width of the screen. However, if I rotate the device, that's going to make the input really large. Now, by default, your emulators, we have this little gray toolbar on the side of my emulator, and that allows us to do things like rotate it. If you click rotate on yours, it will show you what happens. I'll answer the question in a second. It shows you what happens if you rotate the device. In order to enable that, though, you have to change the settings on your Android virtual device. So if you click up at the top of the screen, right underneath the black, you can pull down your settings. By default, this is the auto rotate button. The Android emulator, typically this is off by default. It's grayed out, which means if we rotate the device, our app isn't going to shift orientations. So what you want to do is click and enable screen rotation. So again, to do that, just click at the very top and drag down. And you want to enable this third button that's got the screen rotation. Now I can try rotating my device and seeing how my app shifts. So you can see that it rotates. And even in orientation, our password edit text is anchored underneath our email edit text, and we're still centered horizontally. So this is the value of constraint layout, that items are not, the positioning is not hard-coded, they're anchored to one another and then potentially anchored within the parent window. So even when the device is rotated, or if we use a different device, the app is going to look fairly similar. So when I rotate back, but you have to turn on that device rotation setting for that to work. There is a max width, yes. So you can set a max width if you want. That's in here. So maybe I want to make the layout width bigger. So what I'm going to do is create for the email, I want the email to be wider than the password. So I'm going to set up a dimension called email width. And it gives me an error here, but it gives me the option to create a new dimension value for email width. So any place in the app we're asking for an email address, we can use this same property, and then all our email inputs will be the same width. So I'm going to click this code hint. It's going to create a resource file called dimens.xml, and I'm going to set this width in DP. We'll maybe set it at 350 DP, and we'll see how wide that is. Actually, maybe for starters, I'll make it smaller so we can get an idea of how big is a density. Is it 1 unit of DP? And then we can modify this. So I'm going to save that. So now in our project, we now under values, we have a dimens.xml with a property called email width set at 50 DP. So I'm going to restart my app. Yeah, Andrew, I'm just going to see how it runs and then I will show you again. No problem. Yeah, so that's the idea. By putting it in the dimension, okay, so 50 is really narrow. So this is the idea, Misam, that if we want to use this width in multiple views or multiple activities, rather than hard coding into each activity, hard coding in the numeric value, we use the resource file instead. So this isn't nearly long enough. So I'm going to go back and maybe make my email 350 DP. So I'm going to update the resource file and restart. Andrew, I haven't forgotten you. Bear with me for just a second. So now our email box is wider. And as I rotate the device, it's still centered, but it's wider. Okay, so let me show you again what I did. So inside, I changed the layout width. It was set as wrap content. This is the default. So I changed this to be at dimen, and I called it email width. So then I clicked this little pop in the gray pop-up. It said create a dimension value. So I clicked that, and then I put in my dimension value in DP in the resource value here. Yes, because the DP, great question, Piyush. The DP depends on the resolution of the device. So yes, it may vary because it's a function of, again, here's the math. 1 DP is 1 pixel on a 160 DPI screen. So if the DPI is higher on the screen, it will be appear at a different size. It's designed to scale. Okay, let's add something else in here. Let's add, so it doesn't actually show the user, we want to add a hint here telling them to enter their email address. So our inputs have a hint property. And again, we could hard code it in. We could say enter your email here. We can do this and it will work, but it's not really recommended. So it says enter your email. It does work. But if we go back to the designer's giving us a warning saying, which keeps disappearing on me. We've got hard-coded text here. So we've hard-coded the string. We should be using a string resource. So I should change that. So we'll go back to the code, and I'm going to generate a new string resource here. Say @string enter underscore email. So we can't have spaces. Now, this is red because this resource doesn't exist. So again, I can hit Alt-Shift-Enter or just mouse over the error, and in the little pop-up, I want to create a string value resource. And the value will say, enter your email. It's going to create that resource in my strings.xml. So we won't see any functional change in the app, but this warning that Android Studio gave me for hard coding that string, that warning is going to go away. Oh, I've got to restart because I created. Anytime we create a new resource, we actually have to restart the app. That we can't just apply the changes. Yep. So what I added here was a hint, and I typed in string enter underscore email. That should turn red. And if you put your mouse over it, you'll get a little pop-up with a blue link that allows you to create the string resource. And in that pop-up, you just put in the message of what should show in the text box. And that generates, or you can do it manually. You can go to strings.xml and you can create this XML node. It's faster just to use the pop-up to do it. So if I go back to the designer, that warning that I got about hard coding, I'm not worried about the autofill right now. But that warning I got about hard coding the hint, it's gone. So now we want to add a button underneath these. And again, we'll play around with some formatting options. So I'm going to click on buttons. I'm going to add a button to my component tree. And in camel case, I'll call it login button. Again, I can click away. If I can just click on the right constraint here, it sets it to 0. If I click on the left, we'll see what this does. So here's our button. No, that didn't do what we want. It gave us the start. Hang on, I'm just going to go back and do that again. I'll delete that. We'll try it again. Put on my button. Give it an ID of login button. And I'll just anchor it in the center horizontally. Or I could do it in code. I could set up the constraint. So my two constraints. And then I want to anchor the top of the button below our password. So if I just type top and I choose the constraint top to bottom of password. So this should move our button down below. So it's down here now. We want to change some of the other formatting on the button. We want to change the text size. We want to change the background color. We want to change the foreground color. And we want to change the text. So again, our code just says button. So we don't want it to say button. We want it to say login. So we're going to use a new string resource. So I'm going to, on the line 35, where my button text says button, I'm going to delete that. And we'll say string, I'll create a string resource called login. Android Studio doesn't recognize that string resource. So again, I'll just mouse over it. I'll click create a string value resource. And I'll type login. So now my button is going to say login. I'll run the app again. And we should get our login button. Bear with me. We've maybe got another maybe 10 minutes or so. We don't have a lot longer to go, and then we'll call it a day and it'll be your weekend. Okay, so our button says login, but we want to change the look of the button. Maybe we also want to make the button span the entire width of the screen. We want to change the color, both colors, foreground and background. We want to change the width as well. We want to change the text size also. So let's set all these things up. So here's our login form at landscape mode and at portrait mode. So I'm going to go back to the design. First, let's change. So we can use the attributes sheet here. Let's change the color. So on the background, I'm going to choose my button. And on the background, if I click in here, sorry, there's a little rectangle on the right. I'm going to click here, and I can set either an icon on the button, or I've got this option here. There's a little 3 buttons. I want to pick a color. So by default, we get 3 colors that come with every Android app: a primary, an accent, and a dark color. So I'm going to pick maybe the accent color, this teal color. You can pick any color in the palette. So these are like a default style. We can play around with those another day. Use different themes. So I'm going to pick an accent color. That turns my button kind of this teal color. If I jump into the code, you see it here. I could even just type it. And Android Studio nicely even gives me a little color swatch here so I can see what it looks like. I also want to change the text color. So I'll scroll down to the text color. Right now it defaults to black text. I want to make the text white. So in text color, if I click this little rectangle, and I can pick any color here. The background light, that's just white. So I'm going to make my text white. The text size, you can see it defaults to 14. I'm going to make a new dimension resource. Maybe we want all the button text to be larger. So down beside text size, well, let's see what happens. Maybe let's pick 18 from here. We'll see whether it tells us to use a string resource or not. We'll set it as 18 for now. So we'll just apply those changes. We'll see how our button changes. So I could make all these changes in the XML, or you can use the property sheet. So our button text is bigger. We've changed both the background and foreground color. The last thing I want to do is I want to make the button, as crazy as it sounds, span the entire width of the screen. However wide the screen is, the button should fill it. So rather than our width wrapping the content, if we change our width to match the parent window, our button should now take up pretty much the whole screen. Yes. So now our button spans the whole width, yet we use SP. So if you want an element to span the entire width of the screen, regardless of size or orientation, you can set the width to match parent. The other thing I want to do is maybe move the whole thing down a little. I want to add some margin or padding above the email so this doesn't appear right at the top of the screen. Yes, there are nested views, but we're not going to get into that right now. So the last thing I'm going to do on my email edit text is I'm going to add a margin at the top. So if I add layout margin top, again, I could set up a new dimension. So I'll just call it demand top margin. And I want to set this in DP. And again, I'll resolve this. I'll create a dimension value. And maybe we'll set this as 40 dp. So 40 density independent pixels from the top. We want to push everything down. So I'm going to add that one dimension, restart my app, and then instead of being butted right up against the top, now everything gets moved down a little bit. Even when I rotate the device, there's some padding. I realize this isn't a beautiful interface. That's fine. We just kind of want to see what some of the options are and how we constrain elements. So we can make things fill the whole screen. We can add margins and padding, and how we resize elements, change colors, etc. Now I will just show you where these colors come from, and then I think we'll call it a day. You'll notice when we set the color on the button, it had color accent. And if we go to our colors file, we have these default colors. So you don't have to stick with these. We could pick something else in the Android palette. So for example, our bar at the top, it's this purple. If I change these hex values, I can change these values. Let's see. To other hex values if I want my bar at the top to be gray. So this has got 3 default styles: color primary dark, and color primary accent. We'll look more at changing these another day, but the heading uses this, the header uses this color primary. So we'll look at material design and some resources around colors and styles another day. But by playing with the resource files, with our colors, our dimensions, and our styles, so we've got them here, we can set up, basically theme our app so that we have a consistent look through it. It's basically the Android equivalent of CSS. Okay, so we sort of did this today. So here's your checklist. Do you have an activity, a couple things for you to do before next week. So we've already done this in class, gone through the spreadsheet. We've done the in-class exercises. I've set up this little board, which I'm going to open up for a second. So another little whiteboard activity. I've invited everybody to the board the other day, so you should have got an invite. Use your mygeorgian.ca email, not your email with your student number. So all I want you to do here is post a sticky note with your name on it somewhere in here, telling me one thing either I already know about Android from today's lesson, one thing I want to know about, or one thing I learned from today. Okay, and this is part of your kind of in-class graded activities. That's 10%. So make sure you complete that. Submit your project proposal on the project website. A number of you have already done that. I'll have a look at those shortly. And then for next week, make sure you submit assignment 1A and do the week 2 quiz. About 2/3 of the class did the first quiz, but make sure you do the weekly quizzes. They count for 20% of your grade. So you can't do any better than 80% in the course if you don't do the quizzes. Okay, so that's what you've got to do for next week's class. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it, Kartik. Thanks for the feedback. I'm doing my best. That's all for today. Thanks, guys. Well, it's really fun to teach a class that's so engaged as you guys are. So have a great weekend. Have a great week. I will stick around in the room for a bit, and if you need any help, yeah, I'll stick around to answer questions, and you can also book office hours for next Tuesday if you need. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording. And Piyush, sure, go right ahead. If it's easier to